Almost nobody teaches this verse the way I'm about to teach it tonight, because almost nobody starts where this verse actually starts, not with comfort, but with a crisis, a real one. A church somewhere near the end of the first century was coming apart at the seams. People were leaving, doctrine was fracturing, and the believers who stayed were terrified they'd backed the losing side. Into that exact moment, an old man, one of the last living eyewitnesses of Jesus himself, picked up a pen and wrote 4 words that a preacher 19 centuries later would build an entire ministry around. 4 words that E.W. Kenyon, the man they called the faith builder, said the enemy of your soul cannot afford for you to actually believe. Tonight, I'm going to do something most teachings on this verse skip entirely. Before we get to the theology, I'm going to show you the actual history, who the real Antichrist was that this verse was written against, what he was teaching, and why it nearly worked. Because once you understand exactly what John's original readers were up against, 1 John 4:4 stops, sounding like a nice sentiment, and starts sounding like exactly what it was. A legal verdict handed down in the middle of a war. By the end of this hour, you're going to understand this verse on 3 levels most believers never reach: the historical level, the linguistic level, and the level Kenyon spent his life trying to get the church to actually live inside. If you're ready for all 3, type verdict in the comments right now. And let's start where the story actually starts. Not in your Bible, but in a city called Ephesus. Picture Ephesus near the end of the 1st century. It's one of the great cities of the ancient world, a hub of trade, philosophy, and religion, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in the Temple of Artemis. And in this city, in the last years of his life, the Apostle John, the same John who leaned on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper, the same John who stood at the foot of the cross, is now an old man, one of the very last living links to Jesus in the flesh. And in that city, something dangerous is spreading through the churches John helped plant. Historians and early church writers point to a man named Corinthus as the figure, or at least the type of figure, standing behind the crisis John is responding to. Corinthus taught something that sounds strange to modern ears, but was devastatingly effective in his own time. He taught that Jesus and the Christ were actually 2 separate things, that the man Jesus was born ordinarily, that the Christ, a divine spiritual power, descended onto him at his baptism, worked through him, performed the miracles, taught the deep truths, and then left him again before the crucifixion. In this teaching, it was only the man Jesus who suffered and died on the cross. The divine Christ, they claimed, never touched real suffering, never touched real flesh, never actually entered the mess of human pain at all. This wasn't a fringe curiosity. This was part of a much larger movement historians call Gnosticism, from the Greek word for knowledge, and it was built on one seductive promise, that true spiritual maturity came through secret, elevated knowledge available only to an inner circle. The ordinary teaching handed down by the apostles wasn't wrong. This movement suggested it was simply incomplete. A starter course for people who hadn't yet ascended to the real revelation. Do you see the strategy yet? Because it's the same strategy operating in different clothing in every generation since. Convince people that the truth they already have isn't enough. Convince them that real power, real breakthrough, real understanding is hidden somewhere else, available only to the specially initiated. Make ordinary believers feel like spiritual tourists standing outside a locked door that only the elite ever get to walk through. And it was working. Some believers in these churches were leaving the fellowship entirely, drawn toward this promise of superior, secret knowledge. And the ones who stayed, the ones John is writing to in this letter, were left rattled. Not because their faith was weak, but because they'd just watched people they respected walk out the door, chasing something that sounded deeper than what they had. This is the actual room 1 John 4:4 was written into, not a cozy Bible study, a church in the aftermath of a split, full of believers wondering if they'd missed something, if the people who left had found a truth they didn't have. Here's what makes John's response so remarkable when you understand the setup. He doesn't try to out-argue Corinthus point by point through the whole letter. He does something much more direct. He tells his readers plainly what the test for truth actually is. Whether a teaching confesses that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, genuinely, fully, without the split Corinthus was selling, And then, just a few verses later, he delivers the line we're studying tonight, aimed squarely at the fear those departures had created. Ye are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Notice what John is doing here. The people chasing secret knowledge walked out that door, convinced they were about to access something greater than what the church already possessed. And John's answer is almost breathtaking in its confidence. You don't need to chase a hidden door. You are already carrying something greater than anything on the other side of it. Greater than the philosophy, greater than the secret teachers, greater than the spirit animating the whole movement pulling people away. This is the detail almost no modern teaching on this verse points out, and it's the detail that reframes everything. The very people this verse was written to were being tempted by the promise of secret, elevated spiritual knowledge. And John's response was to tell them the real secret had already been given to them, and they'd been sitting on it the whole time. That irony is the doorway into everything Kenyon would spend his life trying to reopen for the modern church 19 centuries later. Part 3. The man who spent his life chasing that one verse. Now let's talk about the man who took this verse more seriously than almost anyone in modern church history. Esek William Kenyon was born in 1867 in Hadley, New York, into a poor family with little formal education available to him. As a young man, he trained in oratory, the art of moving an audience with the spoken word, before a conversion experience at 19 redirected his entire life. But here's the detail Kenyon himself pointed back to again and again in his later ministry. That first conversion didn't hold. He fell away. And by his own account, the reason was simple. Nobody had ever grounded him in what he actually possessed the moment he believed. He knew he'd been saved. Nobody ever showed him he'd been armed. When his faith was eventually rebuilt, that missing piece became the engine of everything he did next. He pastored small churches across New England, and then, refusing to raise funds through the methods common in his day, he built an independent work that trusted God alone for provision, modeled on the life of George Muller, the famous English minister who fed and housed thousands of orphans without ever directly asking a human being for money. Around the turn of the century, Kenyon opened Bethel Bible Institute in Spencer, Massachusetts. He ran it for 25 years on a principle that sounds almost impossible today. No tuition charged, no salaries paid to teachers, every need for the school met entirely through prayer. Well-educated Bible scholars gave up stable positions to come teach there for nothing but the conviction that what they were building mattered. Missionaries trained under his teaching went out from that institute around the world. In 1923, Kenyon relocated to Southern California, planted a church that grew past 1,000 members, and in 1931 pioneered something few pastors of his era had attempted, a national Christian radio broadcast called Kenyon's Church of the Air. Reports of healing followed the broadcasts, and the public gave him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life, the Faith Builder. Here's why all of this matters to the verse we're studying. Kenyon's students, men like Kenneth Hagin, Oral Roberts, and Kenneth Copeland, would go on to shape an entire generation of Word of Faith teaching, and virtually every one of them can trace core threads of what they taught back to a relatively obscure New England pastor who spent his life circling one central obsession, closing the gap between what a believer legally possesses in Christ and what that same believer actually experiences day to day. And no verse captured that obsession more precisely than the one an old apostle wrote to a frightened, fractured church in Ephesus, roughly 18 centuries before Kenyon was even born. Now we get into the verse itself. And I want to slow all the way down here because this is where Kenyon's teaching gets its actual weight, not from emotional intensity, but from what's sitting underneath the English words most of us have read past 1,000 times without ever really seeing. Let's take this apart piece by piece. First, in you. In the original Greek, this phrase is built on the preposition in, a word that indicates internal presence, not nearby presence, not alongside you, not watching over you, inside you. This is the same construction Paul uses when he describes a mystery hidden for generations and only now revealed, Christ in you, the hope of glory. The entire architecture of how most people pray assumes distance. God is somewhere else, and prayer is the effort of closing that distance. This phrase quietly demolishes that assumption. There is no distance to close. The distance was already closed the moment you were born again. Second, greater. The Greek word here, meson, isn't a word about brute strength, the way we might use bigger in a schoolyard argument. It's a comparative used throughout the New Testament to establish relative rank and authority, the kind of word you'd use to settle a dispute about who holds higher standing, not just who happens to be physically larger. Kenyon leaned hard into this distinction because he believed most Christians quietly read this verse as a hopeful guess. I think God is probably stronger if it comes down to it. The actual word is closer to a settled ranking already on the books, not a hope, a hierarchy already established. Third, have overcome. This is written in what's called the perfect tense in Greek, a construction describing a completed past action whose results are still fully in effect right now. It's the exact same grammatical shape used later in Revelation, where believers overcome the accuser by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. John isn't telling his frightened readers, you will eventually win this. He's telling them the win already happened, and you are currently standing inside its result. One of those is a promise about the future. The other is a fact about right now, this evening, in whatever room you're sitting in as you watch this. Fourth, and this is the one almost nobody points out, the world. The Greek word is cosmos, and in John's writing, it doesn't simply mean the planet or the physical creation. It refers to the entire organized system of thought, culture, and spiritual influence operating in opposition to God. The very system Corinthus' teaching was thriving inside of. John had already told his readers earlier in this same letter exactly what spirit animates that system, the spirit of Antichrist, already at work in the world, already active before this letter was even written. This is not a vague reference to bad things out there. It's a named, specific, operating spiritual force, the same force behind the secret knowledge movement that had just split their church. Put all four of these together, and here's what the verse is actually saying. Underneath the English translation, most of us grew up reading, the one who has taken up permanent internal residence inside you already holds an established superior rank over the spirit animating the entire opposing system, and the victory over that system is not a future hope. It is a completed present fact you are already standing inside, right now, whether you feel it or not. That is not a devotional thought for a hard week. That is a legal and spiritual reality most believers have simply never been shown how to read. Here's where the historical thread and the modern application meet. And I think this is genuinely one of the most overlooked observations in how this verse gets taught. The entire Gnostic movement Corinthus represented ran on a single engine. Convince people that what they already have isn't enough, and that real power is locked behind a door only the specially initiated get to walk through. That engine never actually shut off. It just changed its packaging. Every generation of believers faces some version of the same whisper, that ordinary faith isn't enough, that there's a deeper secret, a hidden technique, a special class of Christian who has access to something you don't. Sometimes it shows up dressed as mysticism. Sometimes it shows up dressed as fear. The quiet suggestion that some believers are simply more favored, more anointed, more equipped than others, and you might not be one of them. Kenyon's entire ministry was, in a very real sense, a direct answer to that same ancient lie, aimed at a 20th century church instead of a 1st century one. His argument was almost identical in shape to John's. You are not missing a secret. You are not waiting on a hidden door. The greatest reality available anywhere in the universe already took up residence inside you the moment you were born again. And the only thing separating you from walking in it is knowledge. Not secret knowledge reserved for an elite few. Revelation knowledge freely available, sitting in a book most believers own multiple copies of and rarely actually search. This is why Kenyon drew such a sharp, often uncomfortable line between what he called sense knowledge and revelation knowledge. Sense knowledge is built entirely from what your eyes, ears, and circumstances report back to you. The test result, the bank balance, the silence where good news should have already arrived. It isn't wrong about what it observes. It's simply incomplete because it can only ever report the visible half of a much larger reality. Revelation knowledge is what fills in the other half. Not by ignoring what your senses report, but by weighing it against something with more legal and spiritual weight, the settled fact that the one inside you already outranks whatever is currently pressing against you. Kenyon didn't consider this optional theological nuance. He considered it the entire difference between a believer who lives defeated and a believer who lives from victory already secured. Part 6. The Gap Between Knowing and Standing. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. If the legal case for this verse is this strong, why do so many sincere believers still live gripped by fear? Kenyon's answer was direct, and it wasn't gentle. He didn't say people lacked sincerity. He didn't say they lacked desire. He said again and again that the church suffered from a lack of knowledge, not information they'd never heard, but truth they'd heard constantly and never actually moved into. Think about the difference between knowing a fact and living inside a fact. You can know with complete intellectual certainty that a chair in front of you will hold your weight, but you don't actually experience that knowledge until you sit down in it. Right up until the moment you do, some small part of you is still bracing, still testing, still hovering just above the seat. Kenyon believed most believers spend their entire spiritual lives hovering above the chair. They agree with 1 John 4:4 intellectually. They quote it during hard seasons. They might even feel a brief surge of courage reading it. And then real pressure returns, and they quietly go right back to bracing, back to begging, back to hoping, back to treating a settled verdict like an application still pending review. Closing that gap in Kenyon's framework was never about trying harder to feel differently. It was about the word being spoken out loud, consistently, deliberately, until it stopped being information you agreed with and became reality you actually stood inside. He often described confession as the mechanism through which a legal truth becomes a lived truth, not a magic formula that manipulates outcomes, but the actual process by which a person moves from mentally agreeing with a verdict to formally taking the seat that verdict already reserved for them. Part 7. What this looks like when the pressure is real. Let's bring this all the way down to the room where it actually matters. Picture the moment fear typically shows up in your life. Late at night, a diagnosis you're still waiting to hear back about, a financial situation that feels like it's closing in from every direction, a relationship slipping through your hands no matter what you try. In that moment, the pull is always the same: to evaluate your entire situation using only what your senses report. The number on the page, the tone in someone's voice, the silence where good news should have already arrived. And in that moment, the ancient temptation resurfaces in modern clothing. The whisper that maybe you're missing something, that maybe other believers have access to a breakthrough you don't, that maybe your faith simply isn't enough this time. The response Kenyon taught wasn't to argue with the fear using logic, and it wasn't to simply try to feel differently through sheer willpower. It was to speak the verdict out loud into the room, not as a magic phrase, but as a legal declaration, the same way a ruling might be formally read into the record to make it official and enforceable in that exact moment. Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world stops being a verse you're reciting from memory and becomes a fact you are formally invoking, reminding your own spirit, your own fear, and the atmosphere of that room exactly who already holds the higher rank, and reminding yourself that the secret you might be tempted to go chasing somewhere else has already been sitting inside you the entire time. Kenyon's teaching was never meant to stay theoretical. So let's make this concrete. 4 practical shifts drawn directly from the framework we've walked through tonight. First, declare it before the pressure arrives, not after you've already been overwhelmed by it. Speak the verdict in the morning, before the phone rings, before the news comes, before fear gets the first word in the conversation. Second, when fear speaks, and it will, don't try to out-reason it with your own logic alone. Meet it with the word itself. Every fearful thought that shows up is an opportunity to formally invoke the verdict again. Greater is he that is in me. And this pressure has no legal ground to stand on here. Third, hold the declaration through what might be called the interval, the gap between speaking the truth and seeing it show up in your circumstances. This is where most people quietly abandon the practice. They declare it once or twice, nothing visibly shifts right away, and they conclude it isn't working. But a legal declaration isn't a vending machine. It's closer to a seed, and seeds require time before they're visible above the ground. Don't abandon the declaration in the interval. Keep it consistent until what you see catches up with what's already true. Fourth, let your prayer come from position, not desperation. Once you actually understand that greater is already residing inside you, prayer stops being an attempt to get God's attention from a distance. You already have His attention. He's not distant. He's resident. You pray from an already established victory, enforcing what was already settled, rather than begging for something to become true that already is. Part 9. What Satan actually cannot survive. Here's the reveal that ties the entire hour together. Whatever spiritual opposition you're facing, however you picture it, is not primarily afraid of religious activity. It's not threatened by sincere but uninformed prayer, by church attendance, by good intentions alone. None of that requires any real knowledge of legal standing to perform, and none of it disturbs a strategy built on your unfamiliarity with the verdict already entered on your behalf. What that opposition cannot survive is a believer who has actually read the court record. The moment 1 John 4:4 stops being a comforting sentence you quote and becomes an accurate legal description, you actually stand inside, internal residence of a superior rank. A victory already completed, an old lie about secret hidden knowledge finally answered by the truth that the real secret was given to you the day you believed. The entire fear-based strategy loses its primary weapon, not because the opposition becomes less real, because its whole operation depended on you never finding out what already lives inside you and what already happened to it at the cross. That is the real meaning underneath tonight's title. It was never really about 4 words being emotionally intimidating on a page. It's that those 4 words, actually believed instead of merely quoted, remove the one asset an ancient strategy has been running on since a church in Ephesus nearly came apart at the seams. You're not knowing the verdict. Close. Sit down in the chair. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight, after everything we've walked through: the city, the split, the old apostle, the New England pastor who spent a lifetime chasing 4 words most people read past without stopping. None of this was ever a secret waiting to be unlocked by an elite few. That was the lie in Ephesus, and it's still the lie now. The real secret was already given in plain language to anyone willing to actually stop and read it. Tonight, stop hovering above the chair. Sit down in it. Say the verse the way it was actually meant to be said, not as a wish, but as a verdict already entered into the record on your behalf. Greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. Say it again, slower this time, like you're reading it into the record yourself. Greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. If tonight's teaching opened something in you, subscribe, because we're going deeper into E.W. Kenyon's teaching on identity authority and the believer's legal standing every single week. Drop the word "settled" in the comments if you're walking out of this video standing on a verdict instead of still waiting for one. I'll see you in the next one.